It wasn't a knock. It was the heavy, dead-weight thud of a body slumping against his door, and the cowboy, a man who'd made a friend of silence, rose slow from his half-eaten supper. He moved like a man who wasn't sure if trouble or a miracle had finally come, calling out here in the God-forsaken dust. He pulled the door open, and the desert wind screamed into the cabin, a bitter ghost carrying the grit of a dying day. And there, at his feet, lay a woman. Her skin was the color of scorched cedar, her breath coming in broken shards. There was blood at her lip and a deep, hollowing hunger in her cheeks. She was Apache, and she was dying. But she lifted her head just an inch, her eyes finding his in the gloom, and she whispered the 6 words that would tear his solitary life to pieces. "My kids are alive. Save them." He'd seen men gut-shot over a card game, seen cattle wither under a brass-hot sun, seen storms rip the roof clean off a cabin. But he had never, in all his years, felt a whisper cut him that deep. She pointed a trembling hand toward the dark maw of the canyon, and then she collapsed, a limp weight in his arms. He carried her inside, laid her gently on the only bed he owned, though he himself had always slept rough on the floorboards. Her body shivered like the last leaf on a winter branch, her eyes squeezed shut as if the world had finally asked for too much. He dribbled water between her cracked lips from his canteen, praying she had the strength to swallow. But her words clawed at him. Kids. Alive. Somewhere out in that cruel, sprawling dark, 3 small souls were waiting for a mother who couldn't rise. His heart, calloused and scarred by years of lonely nights and whiskey-soaked dreams, cracked just enough for a sliver of light to get in. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed the old tin lantern, and stepped back out into the night. The desert was a vast, pitiless thing. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries sounding like mocking laughter. The stars hung overhead, cold and sharp as coffin nails. He had no trail to follow, nothing but the ghost of her pointing hand and the direction of the canyon, where colossal stone walls loomed like sleeping, hungry giants. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. It sounded like bones breaking. For an hour he walked, sweeping the lantern's weak, yellow eye across the landscape of rock and thorn. He was about to turn back, to admit defeat, when he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost part of the wind. A hum. He followed the noise to a hollow tucked beneath a leaning boulder, a natural shelter from the biting wind. And there they were, 3 children, clinging together so tightly they looked like a single trembling creature. The boy, maybe 6 years old, held a sharpened stick like a spear, his eyes wild with a mix of fever and fear. The oldest girl, 10 at most, had her arms wrapped around the other 2, her gaze fierce and protective, a warrior's stare in a child's face. And beside her, a smaller sister, no more than 8, was humming that forgotten lullaby, though her lips quivered with a hunger so deep it was painful to watch. The cowboy knelt, slow and deliberate, the way you'd approach a spooked colt. He didn't want to scare them. He kept the lantern low and spoke in a whisper, the same soft, certain tone their mother had used. "Your mama. She's safe now. I'll take you home." The boy's stick lowered, then dropped from his trembling fingers into the dust. The oldest girl studied the cowboy's face, her eyes weighing the stranger's promise against a lifetime of danger. After a long moment, she gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. That single nod felt heavier than any oath he had ever sworn. He gathered the youngest girl into his arms, her body as thin and light as a bundle of reeds, and led the other 2 with patient steps back toward the distant, flickering light of his cabin. The lantern's glow carved a fragile, moving circle in the vast, crushing dark, the only proof that life still burned in this desolate land. When they finally stumbled back into the cabin, the rich smell of beans still simmering on the stove greeted them like a hymn. The children's eyes widened at the sight of the food, a look of pure, primal need. But they didn't lunge for it. Hunger, he realized, had taught them suspicion above all else. He set slices of thick bread on the table, poured what was left of his milk into 3 tin cups, and then he just waited. At first, they touched the food like it was a mirage, like it might vanish if they moved too quickly. Then, slowly, tentatively, they ate. And soon, the heavy silence of the cabin was filled with the gentle scrape of spoons against tin plates, the quiet, life-affirming gulps of children finally tasting nourishment. On the bed, the woman stirred. Fever sweat glistened on her brow. Her eyes flickered open, hazy and unfocused, until they landed on the sight of her 3 children at the table, alive and eating. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. In that moment, watching that tear fall, the cowboy thought he had never witnessed anything holier in his entire life. As the children, their bellies full for the first time in days, drifted into an uneasy sleep by the hearth, he turned his attention back to their mother. He tended to her through the night, changing the cool cloth on her forehead, feeding her tiny sips of broth whenever she could take them. Her breath rattled in her chest like loose nails in a coffin, but she clung to life with a stubborn, quiet grace. He sat in the chair by her bed, listening to the wind scratch and claw at the cabin walls, his own profound loneliness a stark echo against the fragile, faltering rhythm of her pulse. He felt like a guardian at the gates of the underworld, fighting to keep her on this side. Toward dawn, the fever spiked. It rose like a wildfire, fierce and consuming. She cried out in her native tongue, words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear, a torrent of pain, of loss, of fear. Her body thrashed on the bed as if spirits were tugging at her from both sides of the veil, trying to pull her apart. He grabbed her hand, his own rough and calloused against her slender fingers. He held on tight and spoke in a low, steady voice, repeating the only truth he had to offer. "The children are safe. They're warm. They're sleeping under my roof." He said it over and over, a mantra against the storm raging inside her. For hours, he fought to anchor her to this world with nothing but his voice and his grip. And then, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the cabin walls, the storm broke. The thrashing stopped. She stilled. Her breathing, though shallow, was even. Her eyes opened. They were no longer clouded by fever, but were lucid and alive. They found his, and for the first time, he saw something in them other than pain or fear. He saw gratitude, raw and unguarded, shining through. In that single, silent gaze, he felt something ancient and frozen inside him begin to shift, something that had been buried under years of dust and silence. He thought she might try to speak, but her lips only parted slightly, then closed again. The weight of her look said more than words ever could. He rose from the chair, his own body aching from the long vigil, and went to stir the fire. For a fleeting, unfamiliar moment, he imagined this place no longer being his alone. He imagined the sound of children's laughter filling the silence. He imagined a life he'd long ago decided wasn't meant for him. And that's when the second knock came. It wasn't the slump of a dying body this time. It was sharp, deliberate, and loud. 3 hard raps that echoed through the small cabin like a judge's gavel. It was the sound of the outside world, the world he had hidden from, announcing that it had found him, and it wasn't finished testing him yet. The knock still hung in the air, a warning bell that made the hair on his arms stand up. The cowboy's hand instinctively went to the stock of the rifle leaning by the door, his heart thudding a hard, heavy rhythm against his ribs. By the fire, the children stirred, their small faces, so recently peaceful in sleep, now shadowed with a familiar worry. On the bed, the woman, Nayeli, he would learn her name was, pushed herself up on trembling arms, her eyes wide with a terror that was clearly not just for herself. He cracked the door open an inch, half expecting to see a posse of marauders, their faces grim in the dawn light. But it was just one man. Old Bart, the storekeeper from town, his beard as white as winter grass, and his face a mask of sour disapproval. Bart's watery eyes flicked past the cowboy's shoulder, taking in the scene inside the cabin. He saw the sleeping children, saw the pale-faced Apache woman wrapped in blankets on the bed. His mouth, a thin line to begin with, set into an even harder line. "You're playing with fire, son," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "Word's out. Folks are saying you're sheltering renegades." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "They won't like it. Trouble will find its way here." Then he tipped his hat, not in greeting, but in grim warning, turned without another word, and trudged off into the breaking day. The cowboy closed the door, the old man's words as heavy as lead in his chest. He turned and looked at Naeli. She was studying his face, her dark eyes searching for the truth of him. She had known too many men who would choose a neighbor's approval over her people's survival. He met her gaze and said the only thing that mattered. "You're safe here." For now, the words carried enough weight to steady her. Days bled into weeks, and the cabin, once a tomb of silence, slowly transformed. It began to feel like a home. Color returned to the children's cheeks. The boy, whose name was Cale, began to shadow the cowboy's every move, his young eyes wide with hero worship, as he watched him split logs with a single perfect strike or carry 2 heavy buckets of water from the well without spilling a drop. The girls, Lyra and Sona, helped their mother grind corn, their small, patient hands learning to mend tears in cloth. Laughter, a sound the cowboy hadn't heard in years, began to creep into the air. It was hesitant at first, like a shy animal, but it grew stronger, like wildflowers pushing their way up through cracks in stone. Naeli healed, but slowly. The deep fever was gone, and her strength was returning, but her eyes often drifted to the horizon, as if she were constantly scanning for a loss she knew was coming. She spoke little of her past, offering only fragments, like pieces of a shattered pot. A husband, gone. A tribe, scattered by violence. Too many graves dug into the unforgiving ground. She didn't tell him everything, not yet. He learned to read the stories in her silences, to measure the growing trust in small gestures. The way she allowed him to brush the fever knots from her long, dark hair. The way she let Cale follow him out to the fields, without a flicker of fear in her eyes. Love, he was discovering, didn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it bloomed in the quiet mercies shared between 2 wounded people. But outside their fragile sanctuary, the whispers in town were growing louder, turning into ugly, snarling rumors. He rode in once for supplies, and the eyes that followed him were no longer curious, but hostile. One man spat in the dirt near his boots. Another muttered the word traitor just loud enough for him to hear. Old Bart filled his sack with beans and flour without a word, but the look he gave the cowboy was a clear and dire forecast. A storm was building, and it was heading straight for him. That night, as the firelight danced and flickered across the cabin walls, Naeli did something she hadn't done before. She told a story. She spoke in her own tongue, the words flowing like a gentle river. He didn't understand a single one, but the soft, melodic sound of her voice seemed to soften the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, to push back the encroaching darkness. The children leaned close to her, their faces wrapped and alight in the warm glow. When she finished, her eyes met his across the flames, and she smiled. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, that smile, but it cut through the thick armor of his solitude like the first rays of sunrise across a frozen landscape. But she wasn't just telling a story. She was testing him. And as he smiled back, he felt he had passed. Later that night, after the children were asleep, she finally told him the truth. The real truth. Her people hadn't just been scattered, they had been massacred. hunted down and slaughtered by a man named Silas Kane, a ruthless land baron who wanted the ground beneath their ancestral home. But Kane hadn't found what he was really looking for. Her husband, before he died, had given her a small, leather-wrapped object. It was a star chart, she explained, carved into a flat piece of obsidian rock, a sacred map passed down through generations. It didn't lead to gold or silver. It led to a hidden place, a sanctuary deep in the canyons known as the Valley of Whispering Waters. It was the last refuge for the few survivors of their tribe. That was what Kane was after. Not just the land, but the map. He wanted to wipe her people from the face of the earth, to erase them completely. The men who had been chasing her, the ones who had left her for dead, they weren't just random thugs. They were Kane's men, and they were still looking for her. The next few days passed with the strange, beautiful rhythm of a family that had never expected to be one. Kyle practiced with a small hatchet the cowboy gave him, his face swelling with pride at each clean strike that bit deep into the wood. The girls learned songs from their mother, their high, clear voices weaving through the air as they worked. The cowboy, a man who had once thought silence was his only companion, found himself humming along to melodies he didn't know the words to. The cabin, once an empty shell for a lonely man, now breathed with the steady, living heartbeat of a family. But he knew it was a borrowed peace, the calm before the storm Bart had promised. One afternoon, he saw it. A plume of dust rising on the horizon, not the hazy, shifting dust of the wind, but the thick, deliberate cloud kicked up by dozens of hooves. A band of riders, their figures hard and sharp against the setting sun. The cowboy felt it before he could properly see it, a cold dread that pressed down on his ribs, stealing the air from his lungs. He stepped outside, his rifle held loosely in his hand, feeling its familiar, reassuring weight. He watched as the riders reined in, forming a grim semicircle before his cabin. Their leader was a broad, ugly man, with a jagged scar that cut across his cheek from his eye to his jaw. He sneered, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "Heard tell you've been harboring savages," he called out, his voice rough as gravel. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Silas Kane. He wants what's his. Best hand them over before you end up sharing their fate." His words hung in the air, a noose ready to be tightened. Behind the cowboy, the cabin door creaked open. Nayeli stepped out into the dying light, her long black hair loose around her shoulders, her children pressed close behind her, peeking out from behind the folds of her dress. She did not cower. She did not flinch. She walked to his side and stood there, silent but unyielding, her presence a vow, a promise, a declaration of war. The cowboy raised his rifle, the barrel steady despite the hurricane raging inside him. His voice, when it came, was low but firm, and it carried across the dusty space between them with the clear, cold finality of a death sentence. "They are mine to protect. You'll not take them." The riders shifted in their saddles, their hands brushing against the handles of their guns. The tension coiled in the air, tight and venomous as a rattler ready to strike. The cowboy's heart pounded, not with fear for himself, but with the terrifying certainty that everything he had just found, everything he had come to cherish, now balanced on the razor's edge of a trigger pull. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The world held its breath. Then, maybe seeing the unbending fire in the cowboy's stance, or maybe just deciding that testing a man with nothing left to lose wasn't worth the pay, the leader with the scar spat into the dust. "Ain't worth the trouble," he growled, more to himself than to anyone else. With a sharp, angry jerk of his reins, he wheeled his horse around. The others followed, their silent threat dissolving as they were carried off by the wind, becoming nothing more than a fading cloud of dust on the horizon. Silence returned, heavy and trembling. The cowboy lowered his rifle, but his hand found Nayeli's and gripped it tight. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and in that single shared gaze, an unspoken truth bound them more tightly than any words or vows ever could. They were no longer a man and a woman, strangers bound by a cruel accident. They were a family, forged in the crucible of defiance and tempered by mercy. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. The children, their eyes wide but their bodies safe, clung to each other. The small wooden structure, once a monument to one man's loneliness, now felt like the last stronghold of hope in a vast and unforgiving world. The cowboy knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not the end. More storms would come. The world, and men like Silas Kane, would not forgive his choice so easily. But as he stood there, Nayeli's hand still held firmly in his, he felt a truth that ran deeper than any fear. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with a soft whisper. Sometimes it arrives with the thunder of a dozen horses, demanding you choose who you are. And this dawn, though hard won, had finally, truly risen. But as Nayeli squeezed his hand, her eyes were still fixed on that fading dust cloud. "That wasn't Kane," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That was just his dog. The wolf is still to come." The cowboy knew she was right. The man with the scar was just hired muscle, a test. The real threat, Silas Kane, was a different kind of monster. He wouldn't be so easily turned away. He would come himself, and he would bring hell with him. The next morning, before the sun had even crested the mountains, the cowboy was up. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a tactician. He walked the perimeter of his small plot of land, his eyes scanning not for game trails, but for defensive positions, for lines of fire, for vulnerabilities. This cabin wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, and he was its only soldier. Inside, Nayeli was making preparations of her own. She wasn't just a mother, she was a survivor. She showed Kyle how to find the bitter root that grew near the well, the one that could be crushed into a poultice to draw out infection from a wound. She taught Lyra and Sona which berries were safe to eat and which would kill a man before he took 10 steps. They were small lessons, but they were lessons of survival. He found her by the well that afternoon, pulling up a bucket of water. "You should take the children and run," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Take the map and go. Find your valley. I can hold them off, buy you time." Nayeli stopped and looked at him, her dark eyes flashing with a fire he was coming to know well. "We have been running our whole lives," she said, her voice quiet but strong as steel. "We ran while Kane's men burned our village. We ran while they hunted our families. My husband died so we could run. I will not run anymore. This is the first time my children have slept without fear. We will not give it up without a fight. We stand here. With you." Her words struck him harder than any bullet could have. He had offered her an escape, but she had offered him something more, a line in the sand, a place to stand and fight for. That night, a strange thing happened. Old Bart, the storekeeper, rode up to the cabin again. He didn't knock this time. He sat on his horse 100 yards out, a silhouette in the moonlight, and waited. The cowboy walked out to meet him, his rifle in his hand. "They're coming," Bart said, his voice a low, worried rasp. "Kane's put a bounty on her head. $1,000, and another 1,000 for the map. Every lowlife, every bounty hunter from here to the border is going to be riding this way. You can't win this fight, son." "Then why are you telling me this, Bart?" the cowboy asked, his voice flat and cold. "Last time you were here, you were warning me to give them up." The old storekeeper looked down at his hands, at the worn leather of his reins. "Because my wife, she was Cherokee," he said, his voice thick with a pain decades old. "I stood by and did nothing when the government men came. I chose my store, my place in town, over her people. I've lived with that ghost every day for 40 years. I ain't gonna watch it happen again." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. "It ain't much," he said, handing it down. ammunition, some medical supplies. It's all I could sneak out." Then he looked the cowboy dead in the eye. "Kane's main force will come from the east, down the main trail. But he's smarter than that. He'll send a smaller group through the old Smuggler's Pass to the north, to cut off your escape." He had just revealed the enemy's entire plan. It was more than a warning. It was an act of treason against the men he was supposed to fear. Bart tipped his hat, a gesture of genuine respect this time, and rode off into the darkness, a man finally trying to pay an old, terrible debt. The cowboy returned to the cabin, his mind racing. Bart's betrayal of Kane had just given them a fighting chance. He explained the plan to Naeli. She listened intently, her face grim but resolute. When he was done, she didn't speak of fear. She spoke of strategy. "The northern pass," she said, her finger tracing a line on the dusty floor. "It is narrow. The rocks are loose. A few men could hold it against many." He looked at her, then at the children. Kyle was watching him, his young face a mixture of fear and a desperate desire to be brave. The boy was trying to be a man before he'd even had a chance to be a child. A new plan began to form in the cowboy's mind, a desperate, dangerous gamble. He wouldn't just defend, he would attack. He spent the next day preparing. He rigged a series of deadfalls along the main trail, heavy logs propped up with ropes that could be cut at a moment's notice. He placed his limited supply of dynamite, left over from his time prospecting, in the narrowest part of the northern pass, burying it under a pile of loose rock to create a devastating landslide. Naeli worked alongside him, her movements efficient and sure. She gathered piles of thorn brush, creating barriers. She showed him how to use the reflection of a piece of broken mirror to send signals. The children, too, had their roles. They gathered stones, filled canteens, and kept watch, their small bodies humming with a nervous, focused energy. They were no longer just victims. They were soldiers in a war for their own survival. As dusk fell on the second day, they saw it again, the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. But this time it was bigger, darker, more menacing. It looked like the wrath of God rolling toward them. "They're here," the cowboy said, his voice grim. He looked at Naeli, at the fierce determination in her eyes. He looked at her children, huddled together but not crying. He felt a surge of something so powerful it almost buckled his knees. It wasn't just love. It was a primal, ferocious need to protect this family, a need that eclipsed his own fear of death. He handed Cale a small, polished stone. "You see that mirror I placed on the ridge?" he said, pointing. "When I flash it twice, you tell your mother. That's the signal." The boy nodded, his small hand closing tightly around the stone. The cowboy took his rifle and a bag of ammunition and slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the rocks and shadows of the landscape he knew so well. He was heading for the northern pass. He was a man who had spent a lifetime running from his past, from the violence he was capable of. But now, he was running toward it. He was going to meet the wolf at the door. He moved through the twilight like a ghost, his steps silent, his body low to the ground. The air grew colder as he climbed higher into the rocky terrain of the northern pass. He found his spot, a small alcove hidden in the rocks that gave him a perfect view of the narrow trail below and a clear line to the dynamite fuse he had laid. He didn't have to wait long. He heard them before he saw them, the scrape of horseshoes on rock, the low murmur of men trying to be quiet. There were 10 of them, moving in single file, led by the same man with the scar he had faced down before, Kane's lieutenant. They were moving confidently, certain they were an unseen flanking force. The cowboy waited. He let the first 3 riders pass his position. He waited until the man with the scar was directly below him. He needed this to be loud. He needed it to be a message. He steadied his rifle on the rock, took a deep breath, and let the air out slow. The shot cracked through the silence of the pass, echoing off the canyon walls like a clap of thunder. The man with the scar was thrown from his saddle, a neat, dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. His men yelled in surprise and confusion, scrambling for cover, their discipline shattering in an instant. But the cowboy wasn't done. He dropped the rifle, grabbed the lit cigarillo from his lips, and touched it to the fuse. It sputtered to life, a tiny, angry snake of fire racing toward the buried dynamite. He didn't wait to watch. He turned and scrambled back down the rocks, away from the pass, his heart hammering against his ribs. The explosion was immense. It was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to rip the mountain in half. The ground shook, and the sound of 1,000,000 tons of rock and earth crashing down into the pass was even louder than the blast itself. The smuggler's pass was no longer a pass. It was a tomb. From his new vantage point on the ridge, he could see the effect of the explosion on the main force below. The massive cloud of dust and the deafening roar had brought them to a halt. Their confident advance had turned into a scene of chaos and confusion. This was the moment. He took out the piece of broken mirror and flashed it twice toward the cabin. Inside, Kyle saw the signal. "Now!" he yelled to his mother. Nayeli didn't hesitate. With Lyra and Sona helping her, she threw open the cabin door and began tossing the piles of dried thorn brush onto the fire. The brush, tinder dry and full of flammable sap, went up in an instant, sending thick, billowing clouds of black smoke pouring into the sky. From a distance, it looked as if the entire cabin was engulfed in a raging inferno. It was the perfect diversion. Down below, Kane's men saw the smoke. They heard the massive explosion from the north. Their flanking force was gone, and their target appeared to be burning to the ground. Their mission was a failure. Their leader was dead. Their morale was broken. He could see them arguing, shouting, their formation breaking apart as men began to turn their horses and ride away, wanting no more part of this cursed piece of land. But one man didn't run. A single rider broke from the disorganized posse and began riding hard toward the cabin. He was a large man on a powerful black horse, and he rode with a grim, relentless purpose. Silas Kane. He wasn't going to be denied his prize so easily. He was coming to see the ashes for himself. The cowboy's blood ran cold. The plan had worked, but it had also isolated the true monster. Now it was just Kane against the family in the cabin, and the cowboy was too far away to stop him. He began to run, his lungs burning, his legs pumping, praying he could get there in time. Kane reached the cabin, dismounting from his horse with a sawed-off shotgun in his hands. He kicked open the door, expecting to find a scene of death and destruction. Instead, he found Nayeli, standing in the middle of the room, the smoke swirling around her from the still smoldering fire, and in her hands she held the obsidian star map. "Looking for this?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying no fear. Kane's eyes widened with greed. "Give it to me, girl," he snarled, raising the shotgun. "Give it to me, and I'll make your death quick." "You have taken everything from me," Nayeli said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "My husband, my people, my home. You will not have this." And then, from the shadows near the hearth, 2 small figures emerged. Lyra and Sona. In their hands, they held blankets, heavy wool blankets that had been soaking in the water trough all day. With a shared cry, they ran forward and threw the wet, heavy blankets over Kane's head and shoulders. He roared in surprise and rage, blinded and tangled, firing the shotgun wildly into the ceiling. The blast deafened them, filling the small room with a cloud of plaster and smoke. At that same moment, a small figure dropped from the rafters above. It was Cale. He had been hiding there the whole time, a length of thick rope in his hands. He landed on Kane's back, wrapping the rope around the bigger man's neck, pulling with all his might. Kane stumbled backward, clawing at the blankets, at the rope, roaring like a wounded bull. He was immensely strong, and he was beginning to break free. He shook Cale off his back like a fly. He ripped the blankets away from his face, his eyes burning with a murderous fury. He raised the shotgun again, this time pointing it directly at Nayeli. And that's when the cowboy burst through the doorway. He didn't have time to aim his rifle. He just ran, launching himself across the room, a human battering ram, and slammed into Cain with all the force he could muster. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The shotgun clattered away into a corner. The fight was brutal and primal. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl. They rolled on the floor, trading blows, fists smashing against flesh and bone. Cain was bigger, heavier, fueled by a lifetime of cruelty. But the cowboy was faster, driven by a desperate, righteous fury. He was fighting for more than his own life. He saw an opening. As they wrestled, his hand closed around the handle of the small hatchet Kyle had been practicing with, which had been knocked from the wood block by the door. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he drove the blunt, heavy back of the hatchet into Cain's temple. There was a sickening crack. Cain's body went limp. His eyes, full of rage just a second before, went vacant. He collapsed on top of the cowboy, a dead weight. Silence descended on the cabin, broken only by the ragged, desperate gasps of the cowboy and the soft crying of the children. He pushed Cain's body off him and slowly, painfully, got to his feet. Nayeli rushed to him, her hands checking him for injuries. The children followed, clinging to his legs. He stood there, in the center of the smoky room, surrounded by the family he had fought for, the family he had almost died for. He looked down at the body of Silas Cain, a man who had built an empire on blood and fear, now lying dead on the floor of a poor man's cabin. Justice hadn't come from a judge or a jury. It had come from a broken family that refused to be broken any further. He looked at Nayeli, at the fierce, beautiful strength in her eyes. He looked at her children, who were looking up at him with a kind of awe. He had spent his life believing he was nothing but a lonely, forgotten man. But in their eyes, he was a hero. He was a father. He was home. They buried Cain in an unmarked grave, leaving the desert to erase the memory of his evil. Bart came by a few days later, and with his help, they packed their few belongings onto a wagon. It was time to go. Time to find the Valley of Whispering Waters. As they stood on the ridge, looking back at the small cabin one last time, Nayeli slipped her hand into his. "It is a long journey," she said. "That's all right," the cowboy replied, squeezing her hand. "We'll make it together." He looked at the three children piled in the back of the wagon, their faces turned toward the future, toward the promise of a new home. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man riding toward his future, a future he never could have imagined, a future filled with a love that had bloomed in the most desolate of places. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a profound and unshakable peace. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found on any map. Sometimes you find them when a stranger falls at your door and you have the courage to open it. If you enjoyed this story and believe that one person's choice can still change the world, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more stories to tell.